review copy from CSL. This is 1995, Milosevic's Last Gamble. This is a somewhat a unique design, I would say. He's created his own series on this, from what I can tell, because a similar set of rules, although of course never absolutely standardized, I suppose, was done for a Korean War game. So this is a hypothetical situation. If you looked at the bombing campaign, etc., against Serbia, it could have gone a lot hotter with Russian intervention and full NATO participation, I guess. And this kind of postulates that. I like what ifs. What's particularly interesting from what I've looked at, and I've just read the rules and set it up, and I see some issues, but is that it tries to do the same kind of things that, say, the victory games, strike games did, Gulf Strike, Aegean Strike, and some of the other games of that period, the fleet games and whatnot. But I'm looking more particularly at the strike set, which is to integrate sort of a pulsed operations with a lot of focus on the air power and multiple missions within a turn and such not. And at least from first reading, it looks like it's doing something that will get rid of some of the... I haven't reviewed any of either of the strike games yet, but there's a clunkiness to them and a degree of record keeping in terms of like how many missions did you fly and whatnot, that this is going to obviate. Anyhow, let's take a look at the components. Of course, since Blue Panther packaged it up, I didn't get exactly what I'm supposed to. I seem to have gotten an extra map, and maybe there's supposed to be something that I didn't get, which is there's vaguely a reference to there being charts and tables. There are some things listed over here, like general records chart, which may be what they're referring to. There may have also been a sheet that was supposed to be attached to it. I don't know. Everything that I need is contained within the rules, but I would feel that it would make a lot of sense to distill a lot of that information onto a separate record sheet. I looked on the back of the map thinking, well, maybe, save money by only doing one printing double-sided with the charts on it and send you both copies. No. But yeah, and there's nothing on the back of the rules, which was something I saw with the Galicia game where I missed out on that. You have a number of different boxes on the board, which are for tracking the air units. And instead of worrying about where they're based and whatnot, like the strike games would, it just kind of represents them as a generic resource. Now, that makes more sense here. One of the problems with the strike games is that you really have to deal with how far away things are based. But this is a localized conflict, and it's fairly easy to get the materials into it. That would be the case with the strike games, except because there's naval competition, essentially, within them, and great distances involved. Being able to project the air power from given bases becomes an important thing. But here they get rid of some of those decisions and just give you hey, here's where the forces actually are. And so you have for each player a set of air bases. These to keep track of units that are routed, which are off the map and can reappear. The actual units. Okay, well, air units are rated as either ground or fighter units with an effectiveness rating attached to them. The higher the effectiveness, the better. Ground units have the unit type symbol, which has some effect. You'll see we have different types of units for the movement point ratio, rates on here. You have a movement number that'll be the right-hand number on them, and on some of the cases it's not very easy to see. Okay, like that one, there is a number there. Let's take it aside, put it under here, see if we can see it now. This has to be the worst printing I've ever seen, actually. I can't get in that close. I think there's a 6 there. This is done to indicate the different types of movement capabilities of the units, where we have 3 different types. One is on black print, one is on red print. That's the difference between motorized and mechanized. And then foot units are this kind of drawn in. And you can see it works perfectly fine on most of the counters where it's mostly readable. What's not terribly readable is the nationality on the counters. That took some effort. There is no player aid that tells you who which country is. Most of the nationalities, if we put it under light where we can actually see, indicate the nation. This is GR, which turns out is German, not Greek. Some of the units do not have any kind of nationality marker on them. Those are the Soviet units down here, or Russian units, sorry. Soviet Union's gone by now. And the Serbian units, which are these dark blue. Now, there is an indication of this over here. It's a little tiny print because the book is so small of an image, and not terribly easy to discern there either. But between everything, I was able to determine what the nationality of all the pieces are, I think. Also, all of the combat, well, there's one more movement type, which is for airborne units, where there's an invisible again. All right, let's find one that's maybe readable. You see, it's that hollowed out to indicate it's a foot unit. It's got an A on it, which indicates that it's an air mobilized unit. It still has foot movement point allowances, but it is also capable of doing air mobile movement. Of course, the foot movement allowance is not on there, but it is handled in the rules. Finally, we have a letter on all the counters. That letter is going to be its combat, I don't remember what the term is for it, but basically it's an indication of the strength point and the morale, the quality of the unit. Here, hearkening back to the old Victory in the West system by SPI, we have these, which indicate the strengths for the different class units. Now, unlike the Victory in the West, there's not like a half strength on the other side or anything. What there is just a different set of the same numbers. You're supposed to flip the counter or otherwise randomize it, and that'll be the side that you actually use when you indicate the strength of the unit. Don't get too upset about that. It gives you a nice hidden strength factors to the units. Personally, I've always thought with Victory in the West you could do with inverted units with a question mark on them or something like that to avoid the extra stacking. Here, though, there's not going to be big stacking. The stacking limitation is one piece per space. So it shouldn't get too annoying to have those in place. It still is a cumbersome process, but it gives you that unknown quality, so you can't pre-calculate things to begin with. Of course, once units start showing their capabilities in fighting, you will be able to. The game is going to use 8-sided dice, which it comes with, which is cool because, frankly, not all wargamers are going to have 8-siders. Most of us will have 10-siders and, of course, 6-siders, but 8-siders are a little rarer in the wargaming community. The rules open up with a large list of acronyms. Some of them, well, not that big a deal, like SAMs. Some of them fairly common things, like, I don't know, Confederate States of America, no. DRM for die roll modifier. But a huge quantity of them are just there to shorten the rule book, as far as I can tell. I think that's not a great practice. That's going to make the game harder to approach for new players. New players of this system, new players to wargaming, and unless you focus heavily on this system, it's going to be really hard to memorize a list of acronyms this big. Makes reading the rules more difficult. Sure, maybe it introduces them once more in every location, like here. It says units movement allowance, MA. But, you know, my feeling is a game should use maybe acronyms equivalent from sort of the standard lexicon. No problem there, and it's a good idea to put them in a glossary, just because there are newer gamers who may not be used to EZOC and stuff like that. Beyond what's relatively standard and used in the industry, I would say maybe add 2 or 3 more. Maybe, you know, and try to limit the number as much as possible. Because as I was reading these rules, I kept finding myself having to look shit up. Okay. Now things like fresh, no problem with that. That's not an acronym. Routed, no problem with that. It's got specific meanings in this game which are defined here, but that's okay. All right. And of course we have a sequence of play here, which is a little different from your normal I go, you go type sequence. It's an interleaved pulsed system. Starts off with reinforcement and recovery, where units come back on the map, or come on the map for the first time. You roll for initiative, which is basically just each player rolls a die, and the high roller wins the initiative. Ties go to Russia, Serbia. Each player allocates their air units to the various boxes that they want to use them for. Not to spend. Then both sides will conduct their strategic bombing missions. Strategic bombing is a rather large class. If you see the strategic bombing box has 2 specified boxes in it, airstrikes and suppression. Suppression is going to be counter air, where you do aerial superiority type fights against, I believe, the patrol box. Airstrikes are going to be strikes against individual units, but I think there's a third type of strategic bombing that doesn't have its own name in there, which is probably strategic bombing. Let's see, strategic bombing phase, suppression, strategic bombing, and airstrike. Yeah. Likewise here with patrol, you're able to put, I believe there's multiple kinds of patrol, and only one of them is going to be, yeah. So there's actual patrols, and then there's escorts. Ground support is going to be used in aid of ground combats when they happen for either side. Interdiction is going to be used when strategic movement is being attempted to prevent units from moving and stop them as they travel down the road. What else do we have? Okay. Action phase, the initiative side moves a unit and does stuff with it, which will include combat. Then the other player moves a unit and does stuff with it. In the doing stuff, because you're only moving one unit at a time, this is going to use a system similar to a couple of other Victory Games systems. One of which is the Lee versus Grant system, where you activate a unit and it attacks, and then nearby units support it. I believe Korean War did the same kind of thing. I'm trying to remember that. Lee versus Grants is more stuck in my head, but I seem to remember that you activate a combat unit as the unit that you're activating in Korean War, and then adjacent supporting units are thrown into the combat as a support. Now I'm not sure. I seem to vaguely remember things. Well, I'm not going to speak to it, but it's a nice design overall, and you can kind of see, hey, if Korea was the first thing he did, of this series, taking that kind of idea onto there makes some sense. Okay, what do we have here then? All right, once both sides have passed or activated all their units or whatever, then all the units will be refreshed. Now, when you use a unit, it flips over, and the only thing that's visible, there's no movement point visible, the only thing that's visible is the quality of the unit. It keeps, I guess, this isn't specified, but I think it keeps the number marker for its strength. I gotta swap batteries out. That would be in alignment with the Victory in the West system, except for Sicily. I think in Sicily you swap them back out after you use them or something. I seem to remember one of them had you discard them. So it was just a one-shot, randomly determine the strength of the unit. It isn't spelled out in here. So it's one of them ambiguities, if I recall correctly. Like, I've just read through the rules once. My charger was not, it was lying to me. This is something that happens. Oh no, this was something that I left out. It may have just run down on its own. All right, going back in the rules to the general concepts or whatever, beyond this whole list of acronyms that we're going to have to flip back and forth to read. We talked about the initiative. NATO has the initiative on the first turn of the game. Well, that's kind of a slipper rule in here. You know, you do something so simple as each player rolls a d8, highest wins initiative, Russia, Serbia wins ties. If it's not mentioned in the setup, and I don't think it is, this is like a key. Oops, let's just slip this rule in somewhere and maybe nobody will notice, you know. That's a dangerous habit. Okay. Player with initiative acts first in the air commitment, takes their first activations in the action phase, and also receives a -1 die roll modifier when undergoing an effectiveness check. That's a good thing. I didn't realize that was there, actually. Because I probably didn't even read this section. I just, skipped over the important concepts. Air power, there's two types of planes in the game. Like I said, there's F, which are going to be more fighter-based, and Gs, which are ground affecting. There's no specific strategic bombing planes. You'll be using your Gs to perform the strategic activity. We've got an effectiveness rating. That's the number they make. An effectiveness check is going to be a die roll where you're trying to get under your effectiveness number. Now, when a plane is hit, it has an effect, or when it's, I don't remember what the term is, spent, I guess. It's going to have a reduced effectiveness number. I think that is spent. I don't remember. And again, that's not spelled out here, what the backside of the plane is. I've been assuming it meant spent, but this is spent. It may be a reduced quality, a reduction. That may be one of the ways you can take hits. You generally have multiple choices as to how to take your damage in this game. Okay. So the types of air missions. Strategic bombing, both Fs and Gs can do this. There's three types of missions: strategic bombing, G attack VP. Okay, I guess G-type planes attack victory points, just like some kind of shorthand there. Airstrike, G against an enemy air unit, or suppression, F against enemy air patrols. Okay. Patrol or escort, only Fs can do this. This intercepts enemy air units or protects a friendly air mission. So you don't commit your fighters to the strategic bombing unless they're doing air suppression. You commit them to the escort role over in patrol. There's some importance as to where you put things. Interdiction, only G's get put in here. This interrupts an enemy strategic movement. And oh boy, you do not need an acronym for strategic movement. This is some of the going overboard, SM, okay? Line of communication, LOC, that's common enough, let it lie. It's gonna be one of the ones that I don't count against you. But SM, not only do I count against you, I say this was just a really bad choice. It was one that you should have reduced because it's not gonna be mentioned that many times in the rules, and it's going overboard by far. All right. Paratroopers have a movement rating of A. They're air mobile units with special qualities. Are there air mobile units that are not those? No, these are the only air mobile units. When activated, a unit using air mobile movement first designates a destination hex, which is any empty hex on the map. The phasing player then decides if any friendly F units in the patrol/escort box, I think they have to be in this specific box at that point, will provide escort. The air mobile units, which kind of bothers me if that's the case. Like, if this was a combined patrol escort box and you could allocate as you wished, that would be a different nature to the game. Here, because there is an actual box for that, I think that I had to pre-allocate some of those flights to commit to escort missions. Is that bad? Is that good? I don't know. You'll see as we play how much that might be a hindrance, but to me it feels like it's a bit of a perversion to the, hey, I'm allocating my air units generally to these things. That was kind of one of the things that had me charmed as I was reading the rules, but now that I see how the boxes are laid out, I'm less on board with it. Okay, the phasing player then decides if any friendly F units in their patrol/escort box will provide escort. The air mobile unit then traces a continuous path of hexes from its existing hex to its destination. Why? Because the non-phasing player can intercept once in any hex along the path using their own F air units from their own, and again, here it says patrol/escort box. That would be this box again by my reading before. So now I'm thrown back into the, how I read this seems like this should say patrol/escort. This should say strategic bombing, airstrikes, suppression missions. And suppression would be all the fighters. So in a sense, that is its own box. But now I'm like torn again. If I'm allowed to intercept with my escorts, why do I have two boxes in there? All right. The air mobile unit traces, then it can intercept. See 6.2 and 6.4 for interception resolution process. If the air mobile unit is not intercepted, then it goes to its designation hex and becomes static. So wherever you landed, it's going to flip over and it's done for the turn. It landed, that was its movement. Okay. Serbian units may not use air mobile movement into Slovakia or Italy. Russians could. There are no Russian air mobile. If an air mobile Slovakia? Really? Slovakia on the map? I see Slovenia up here. Maybe that's what they mean. But I don't think Slovakia is on the map. There's another fuzzy place where, like, it looks like there should be Bosnia-Herzegovinian units, and as I'm looking at the map, according to the setup rules, and there aren't any that I could tell, which is okay because the Serbs are allowed to set up inside Bosnia-Herzegovina, but whatever's, yeah, okay. Okay. If an air mobile unit is placed on an unoccupied but enemy-controlled city, it'll be subject to SAM fire with a DRM of +1. When using normal ground movement, air mobile units have a 6 movement point and are considered foot infantry. They cannot combine the two movements in the same activation. All right, I'm going to pause there because my battery is iffy, and I'm thinking about sitting outside and reading and maybe having a drink. Okay, still working our way through here. Units have a zone of control and the 6 hexes around them. Even static units do, i.e. ones that have been used for the round. It's blocked by ridge hex sides. We have, I believe those are these. Yep. A few of them scattered around. Kind of a weird thing, but because mountains look a lot like ridges, and then the ridges are just like this hex spine of the mountain, but they have somewhat different effects. Like the zone of control. It does not extend into enemy-controlled city hexes. An enemy zone of control forces a friendly unit to stop moving or to attempt a meeting engagement. So again, like some of those games that I mentioned, notably the Korean War game, this idea of you expend your movement points and then you use some of them to attack fits in with that meeting engagement concept. Here, though, you're allowed to use supporting units in it. I think you weren't allowed to use them, at least in Lee versus Grant. So, a unit may retreat through an enemy zone of control if occupied by a friendly unit, but must not finish its retreat in an enemy zone of control, otherwise it is routed. Well, you wouldn't be, well, you're kind of allowed to overstack at times. A line of communications cannot be traced through an enemy zone of control unless occupied by a friendly unit. Fairly standard. The combat chits, I've already talked to you about these. When a unit enters combat, each player draws a random chit, flips it like a coin. Okay, so here it says each player, which may mean it's always completely random. The number next to the letter corresponds to a unit's UQR is its, and UQR, if we look it up, unit quality rating, that's the letter, is its combat strength. This combat chit remains with a unit until the end of the game. Okay, so I think that's pretty clear how it's meant to be used. End of the game turn, when it's removed during the cleanup phase. Okay, so this is kind of interesting because you wouldn't draw one whenever you enter combat, but only if you don't already have one. But they don't last beyond the game turn. So the unit's capabilities are not fixed throughout the game. Now, because this is a pulsed game, that means there's nothing weird like one side keeps the combat chit longer than another, or anything like that. Some units will keep it longer than others, but that's just based on when they were activated, etc. Stacking only one unit per hex at the end of movement or combat, the end of any movement or combat. Air units and other markers do not count towards stacking. Reinforcements can temporarily overstack when placed, but the overstacked units must be activated and moved before any other, before other friendly units on the map. It really should be any, but there's a slight difference that can be interpreted into that, but can be activated during an action phase. If an overstacked hex is attacked, the overstacked units must be eliminated until the stacking limit of one unit is reached, which means for something very, very potentially dangerous in the case of if you end up with overstacked units. I don't know if there's any other way other than reinforcement, but whatever. LOC, line of communication. You only have to check during combat if you wish to substitute one VP for one LP. All right, I know these already. VP is obvious, victory points. LP is loss points. When you take casualties, though, you're allowed to expend victory point. Well, when you take loss points, one of your options from the menu is to take victory point penalties. There are many options. An LOC is defined as a path of no more than 5 movement points from the tracing unit to a rotor highway that can trace a continuous line of unlimited rotor highway hexes unobstructed by enemy units or their zone of control. I assume these are also unimpeded by zone of control or units, to a supply source. An LOC can be traced through an enemy zone of control if it's occupied by a friendly unit. And I guess that's both sides, again, of the LOC. Supply sources for NATO are the west edge of the map via Italy and any port hex on the Adriatic. Supply sources for Russia, Serbia are Belgrade, Novi Sad, and Nice. Okay, we have Belgrade here. I don't think Belgrade's in the game. We have Belgrade in the game. Novi Sad, and I can't remember where Nice is. That's pretty important for me to remember, and it's not just jumping out at me here. Something tells me it's in Serbia. Could be in Montenegro, but see here we're moving into. All right, I do not know where Nice is. Maybe it's under here somewhere. There's a lot there, but I think there's only 2 towns here. These 2. Oh well, this blows. Is it way up here? See, this is within Bosnia, so I'm not expecting it to be there. And I do not know where Nice is. Yeah, well. Crap. You would think I would know this. All right, I'm gonna pull aside and try to look for it. I'll find it. I've looked everywhere. There is an unnamed city down here, but and I didn't look under the Croatians nor the Italians or Slovenians. The Croatians are the most likely. I don't think Nice is in Albania. That would be a little weird, but it might be. So I am going to go Google Nice and see if this is supposed to be it. It's the only possibility I have, unless there's a misnaming, right? Like I said, Belgrade is Beograd here. Novi Sad is fine. Who knows what it could be, though. Advantages of the second map and maybe why they send it. Okay, so it's fairly far south from Belgrade, and it's not in Montenegro, which doesn't seem to be distinguished from Serbia here. I'm thinking it might be this. It could be this. I don't think it's this far south. I looked on Google Maps and, you know, didn't see another name for it, but I didn't look too hard for that. But yeah, it's not labeled on the map very clearly. Okay, where are we? So they have something else that can be a line of communications. But yeah, we've got at least 2 errors on the map, that one of which I don't know how to resolve. Okay. And I remember Nice in, it's definitely not in Albania. I remember it from Tito, you know. Okay, sequence of play, first reinforcements and recovery. I've kind of gone over this. The initiative check, commit the air units, alternate moving pieces, and then there's a cleanup where NATO and Russian attrition can happen. Not familiar with what that's going to be, so we'll keep that in mind. Remove combat chits from the map and put them back in the cup, shake it generously, and move the game turn marker ahead. And I'm kind of happy there's only 12 game turns. When I see things like the Galicia, the East Prussia with 20 or more game turns, you know, I'm not a wuss when it comes to big games, but I'm kind of a wuss when I'm not really expecting something that's going to take that long. So this is probably more in the milder end of things. Yeah, it's good. Okay, now here it says, note that unlike other PCS games, now, I don't know if Korea is available. That's the only one I'm even aware of, so. There's only one action phase per turn. So I guess in some of them they have a, hey, you get to move all your pieces and then they get reset and you get to move them again, so that there's less of the air support and whatnot in there. All right, joint reinforcement and recovery. Both sides get reinforcements on various turns. Every turn they check each routed unit, the ones that'll be in the box, to see if it recovers or surrenders. Reinforcements and recovered units enter the map in or adjacent to an eligible entry hex. To be eligible, the hex must be controlled, but it may be in an enemy zone. Reinforcements may temporarily overstack on eligible entry hexes, but all overstacked units must be activated and moved in the action phase before any other units are activated, which can cause you definitely some nightmares. I can almost guarantee that, because it means that your initiatives are going to be used up on bringing those reinforcements in. That's kind of, it's possible that reinforcements are going to screw up your plans unless you can delay them. Eligible hexes for the non-Balkan NATO units are Trieste, Rijeka, Zadar, and Dubrovnik. So that's going to be the ports, Trieste and Rijeka, yeah. So all the port cities. Eligible entry hexes for the Slovenians are Ljubljana and Maribor, neither of which are very familiar to me. And the only eligible entry units for Russians are in Beograd. And for Serbians, it's any city inside Serbia and 24509 Banja Luka. You know, it would be helpful if they give the hexes for Nice at least. 2509. So 2509 is not a location. I assume it's 2409 here. Which is inside Bosnia, which feels a little weird, but okay. All right, it could be they reformed units there. All right. Only American, British, Croatian, and Slovenian units start on the board on the map. Each game turn in reinforcement and recovery for NATO, they roll a D8 and refer to the reinforcements to determine which countries' reinforcements are sourced. If the role is a nation that's already contributed reinforcements, then they get nothing additional. Special NATO reinforcements, if a Russia or Serbian unit moves into Trieste and Italian units have not been deployed, then the Italians are placed immediately in any unoccupied hexes in Italy. Now, Trieste is an automatic victory, so that could be problematic. I think it comes at the end of the turn. Gives Italy a chance to throw them out. If a Russian or Serbian unit is in Trieste at the end of any turn, then the Russian-Serbian player automatically wins a major victory. Okay, it's clarified there. So we've got 4 different nationalities. You will get one. Now, when you look at these, Germany, Canada, Italy, and France. All right. This is purely a hypothetical situation. I really question whether Article 5 engagement would come into play where Germany or France or even Italy, for that matter, Canada I'm a little bit more convinced of, would deploy additional troops. I know this was a NATO operation, but I'm not at all convinced that an offensive NATO operation, which this was, and probably illegal for that matter, into Yugoslavia or the remnants of Yugoslavia would have at all triggered this kind of response from so many nations. The bombings, that's one thing. But you've got NATO actually going in here. And wow. Now, of course, Russia is also in already, which it's just, again, it's a what if. I'm debating the premise. It doesn't mean anything about the game. Okay, Russian-Serbian reinforcements. All Russian Serbs start on the board except for the 3VO, which are these units with red on them. That's a fairly large set of units. I'm going to have to swap batteries. Every turn from the second turn onward, the Russian-Serbian player rolls a die. If it's less than the current game turn, those reinforcements may enter, those Russian-Serbian reinforcements may enter in an eligible entry hex. I don't know what this represents. I'm not really familiar enough with the history here to know what the hell kind of reserve Serbia could have called up that they didn't already have engaged. But we're going to swap batteries here. And for reinforcements, then you also check to see if any routed units come on. Each routed unit, you roll a die, and you look on the recovery table. See 5.31 below, because it's not on the board, which means I'm going to have to be flipping through the rules. Well, we got a number for NATO and for Serbia. A result equal to or more than the nation's listed number results in the unit's successful recovery, and it re-enters the game immediately like a reinforcement. Now this is a little weird, right? The recovery numbers you want to roll above, whereas the quality numbers you want to roll below. I'm kind of annoyed by pick a direction, in general, what's good, what's bad. Okay, a result must be equal to or more. A unit that rolls a 1 will have surrendered and is permanently removed from the game, earning the opponent 1 victory point per unit. Serbian units that roll an 8 may be placed in any Serbian city, regardless of control, unless it's occupied by a NATO unit. Thus, NATO needs to garrison stuff. Routed Russian units are permanently removed from the game and may not attempt recovery rolls, but they don't count as surrendered. And here they go into, hey, this wasn't a good time for the Russian army. They were mainly a volunteer force, poorly trained. This is kind of prescient. I don't know, how much information there really was available at that point. Obviously, it was not at whatever level we thought the Soviet Union's army was at by this point, but I'm not really convinced that it had disintegrated. But I'm also not necessarily convinced that the Soviet Union's army was as good as we thought it was. Certainly, there has been a deterioration. But, the kind of war that they faced in Afghanistan was a very different type of battle from what they're, say, facing in Yugoslavia right now, or in Chechnya, where they had troubles as well until they went incredibly bloody. Air missions. Okay, air is a big part of this game. Both sides have air units used to influence maneuvers in combat on the ground. Starting with the player who holds the initiative, players remove all air units from all air boxes on the map and then alternate placing them into the mission boxes. Okay, so this is how you allocate. Strategic bombing, 3 separate mission types. Patrol escort. Okay, it doesn't specify that there's 2 mission types there. Ground support and interdiction printed on the map. Okay. It's not made clear whether you put them in the subcategories at this point, and how they're processed so far has been left kind of fuzzy. The initiative player then performs all 3 of the strategic bombing type missions in order: suppression, strategic bombing, and airstrike, followed by the non-initiative player. The other air missions are performed during the action phase. After strategic bombing, airstrike, or ground support, or interdiction, the defending player checks for SAM fire. After completing any of the missions, remaining air units, those not yet in the spent box are eliminated, check their on-call status. This is how we handle multiple missions within the course of a turn. So when I reference like the strike games, all the U.S. Planes would basically get 3 missions per turn. All of the Soviet, I don't remember if the Soviet got 2 or 3, but things like Iran would get 2. Iraq would get 2 because their air quality, the quality of their maintenance, etc., was lower, and they couldn't turn around as many missions with the same size planes. Here, instead, they handle it through a different mechanism, which allows you to roll to see against the quality of the air crew and see if it comes about. And that works, I think, better, although I haven't tried playing it yet. There was a clunkiness to those strike games. Okay, strategic bombing. For strategic bombing allocation, each air unit must be assigned to one of the strategic bombing, airstrike, or suppression boxes. Okay, there it's specific. After all air assignments are completed, players conduct missions with air units assigned to the 3 strategic bombing boxes, with the initiative player first undertaking all missions in the order below than the non-initiative player. First, you do suppression. F units assigned to the suppression box aim to suppress enemy F units that are currently on patrol or escort. Each air unit attempting an EC, okay, that's an effectiveness check if I recall correctly, and that we don't know how to do yet, but it's going to be a roll against this number, and I think you want to get lower. Well, equal to or lower, but each air unit attempts, and for each success, the enemy player must place 1 F air unit currently in the patrol escort box into the spent air box, and each side has their own set, their own tracks, where it will stay for the remainder of the turn. Once an air unit is spent, it's not going to do any more missions. At the completion of the mission, each active F unit checks its own on-call status, and that's basically to see, is it spent or is it available for another mission? And you don't, and yeah, well, we'll get to that in a moment. Because I think you have to declare the type of mission you're preparing for at the point at which you do the on-call status, which is okay. It does mean you have less flexibility, though, in terms of reaction. The active player selects, for strategic bombing, selects all G air units in the strategic bombing box, which I guess is the surrounding part of the box, and decides if any F units from the patrol escort box, you don't assign them to the strategic bombing to begin with, will accompany them. The opposing player then decides whether to intercept with F units from the patrol escort box. You don't have to trace from airfields or anything like that. That's all been abstracted away. It's assumed that, and again, the territory here is like one of the large hexes in the strike games. You assume that everything can kind of reach, which is a nice factor, not having to keep track of the per airbase stuff. Where are we? Okay. The opposing player then decides whether to intercept with any F units. Once any ATAC, okay. I know what this means, but it's like, I don't know, air tactical, I don't know. So we'll look this one up. This is outside of my bill. Air-to-air combat. I think a 2 in there instead of a T would have been cool. Just to help remind, but I would rather not have this many acronyms. Is completed, and it gives you the reference nicely. There are places where there aren't enough references. Then if any G air units remain in flight, G being the strategic bombers with the G letter on them, and the G stands for, let's look up, but it's really a type, and I don't mind that. Ground support air units. Your strategic bombing is going to be done with ground support, which feels funny, but then if any G air units remain in the flight, they each attempt an EC, an effectiveness check against their number. We don't have rules on effectiveness check yet. But maybe we do. Maybe I skimmed over that. Or maybe it's defined in here. Unfortunately, it's defined here. Effectiveness check is a roll equal to or less than the ER. ER is effectiveness rating. Success, equal or less is a success, -1 for the initiative player. Okay. Only the air units seem to have an effectiveness, so that's fine. Where are we again after looking up all these acronyms? If there are 1 or more successes, then the bombing player gains a victory point, i.e. a NATO bombing would cause the victory points to go up by 1. Russian-Serbian would cause victory points to fall by 1. Now the victory point marker starts at 7. Once it gets into the green area, NATO's winning. While it's in the red area, Russia-Serbia's winning. But there's 2 sides to it. And I'm really not sure. I guess I'll flip it when it gets into the other area. I don't really know why there's 2 sides. I don't think you can go and wrap around backwards. I remember there being an exclusion to being able to do that. Okay. Which would have been a chart that made sense in some ways. I don't know. Where are we here? The G air units then each check for SAM fire, and then each remaining air unit that participated checks its on-call status to see if it ends up spent or can do another mission. Now, that other mission, I think, cannot be strategic bombing. You only get 1 shot at each of the strategic bombings, and then the other missions for which you would have the choice of ground support or interdiction with G units, would be in reserve to do that mission later in the game. Turn. Airstrike. Okay, this is the next one here. The active player identifies an enemy unit on the map as the strike target, then selects any number of G units assigned to airstrike mission box, and decides if any Fs from the patrol escort will accompany them. The opposing player decides whether to intercept with any F units. You don't have to check ranges or make rolls or anything. Once any ATAC is completed, then if any Gs remove in flight, they each attempt an EC. You see how annoying this is to read? If there is at least 1 successful roll, the player rolls a D8. On a 1 or 2, the ground unit is routed. Otherwise, it becomes static. So if you can get bombers to the place, at the very least, you freeze the enemy unit for the turn. And at the best, you throw it into the routed box, and it may be out of play forever, actually. The G air units then check for SAM fire, and each remaining air unit that participated in it checks for on-call status. A ground unit can be attacked by multiple airstrikes, but additional static results have no effect. So if you get through, you probably don't want to keep hitting that unit. We did all of these. Suppression first, then strategic bombing, then airstrike. Patrols escorts. Any units in the patrol escort box can be used as interceptors for enemy air units or against air mobile movement. Or is it airmobile? Is it Playmobil or Playmobil? Or escort friendly air units or units using air mobile during the strategic bombing or action phases. The patrol box and the escort sub-box are interchangeable, unlike the strategic bombing sub-boxes, and are just there as a reminder. Okay, so that is clarified there. After the active players have decided whether to provide escorts, I again wish it were marked up here, patrol/escort instead of a little box in there. And I wish there was a strategic bombing box in addition to those two. It's just, personal grumpiness. After the active players decided whether to provide escorts for a mission, the opposing player decides whether or not to intercept with any Fs in the patrol escort box. If so, they conduct the ATAC, and at its conclusion, determine if any interceptors get past any escorts to attack the G air units. Okay. So this is how interception is done. The interceptors fight the escort. The patrolling interceptors fight the also patrolling escorts that have been assigned. And if they get through, then they do an attack on the G units, which appears to be another kind of ATAC. At completion of the mission, each remaining F unit that participated checks its on-call status. When attacking an air mobile unit, if any interceptors get past any escorts, the interceptors each attempt an EC. If a 1 is rolled by any of them, then the air mobile unit is immediately routed. If at least one EC is successful but no 1s, the air mobile unit halts in the hex it was intercepted in and becomes static. Otherwise, the air mobile unit gets to continue its movement. So there your choices are stopping the air mobile unit early, which might be very early because, again, the ranges are basically infinite on the air units, or destroying it, routing it. Interdiction. G air units assigned to the interdiction box may attempt to interrupt enemy ground units undertaking SM. Okay, so if they're doing anything sadomasochistic, which you could probably call some of the war crimes that. That's strategic movement. Again, I remember it. I would wish it weren't in there. I wish it were spelled out. It isn't used that much. Or tracing an LOC for combat. Okay, it's the or tracing an LOC for combat that's probably the more useful. After any G units are selected for interdiction, the player then determines whether any F units in the patrol escort will escort them. Then the other player decides whether or not to intercept. Wow. Oh, my lights are going crazy. Jesus. I gotta change something there. I don't know if I can fix it, but I might be able to jiggle something. And then the other player decides whether to intercept with any F units, and then you handle the interception. Now we're at SM interdiction. That's going to be strategic movement interdiction. We will also then have the combat LOC interdiction. Weird because, I'm going to really disturb you here. One of the two lights, so those two lights that are on are always on. The other two are further down on the power supply, so they're not getting quite enough power. I've got the dimmer all the way up. Unfortunately, LEDs don't all handle dimmers, and these didn't. But when I have it all the way up, they used to all work, and now they're like not giving enough power. And I tried going up there and screwing them in differently. One of them was out completely for a while. Now, like the third one was out completely. Now it's kind of on, but I think it's creating more flashing, and it's just really fucking weird. Okay. Sadomasochism interdiction. Whenever the phasing player is using a strategic movement, the non-phasing player may interrupt the movement at any point to undertake an interdiction. And I assume that includes before they actually move. I'm not positive, but after the conclusion of any ATAC, then if the G units remain on mission, and again, this after the conclusion of any ATAC, after the interception is resolved, if any G units are still there, then at least one EC effectiveness check by the Gs is successfully performed, the phasing player must immediately end their activation, flipping the activated unit to static on the hex where it halted. Exception, no interdiction attempts may be made against overstacked hexes. Well, that's good because those can kill you. The G air units, but you might be in a position where you can only move by remaining overstacked. Oh. The G air units must then check for SAM fire. Now, this is in the exception. That's a mistake. That should not be written this way. I would put the exception below all of it, but at the very least, there should be a hard break there. But yeah, the G air units must then check for SAM fire, and each remaining air unit that participated checks on call status. Combat LOC interdiction. Whenever combat is declared, whether me or pa, I'm trying to remember what these actually stand for. I know what they mean. Me is a meeting engagement. That's right. And pa is a prepared attack, or there's another word for that that's not used in this, so I'll leave it alone. Both players may use G air units assigned to interdiction missions to cut their opponent's LOC at the same time as any G units are assigned for ground support. The phasing player decides first what air units, including interdiction, ground support, and escorts to use, and then the non-phasing player makes the same determination. If either player commits F units, okay, so this is weird. This is not quite correct, but I think we can parse what it means. If either player commits F units, then ATAC occurs. Okay. So, unlike other air missions, I think the intention here is you're committing some stuff to ground attack, some stuff to interdiction, and that's easy. Those can be covered from here. Some F units to a multifaceted role into the combat area, and they can do either interception or defense. Okay, if either one shows up, they say ATAC occurs. Now, that's not exactly the case, right? Because the only way that there's going to be ATAC or air combat is if both players send planes and at least one of them sends a fighter into the area. Okay, but anyway. It's worded incorrectly, and it's hard to express that whole thing. And this is me trying to guess the meaning from what's worded there. Maybe I'm completely off base, but that seems the most sensible interpretation of why you would write something this way. After the conclusion of this, if any G units remain on the interdiction mission, then the opponent may not satisfy LP in combat using VP. Remember, the penalty for not having a line of communication is you can't expend victory points to take loss points. The G units must then check for SAM fire, and each remaining air unit that participates checks on call status. Okay, that's the interdiction part, but it is melding in the ground support part, right? Ground support has not been addressed yet. Will it be? I don't think so. Okay, it may be addressed only as modifiers in the ground combat portion of the rules. Again, this is disturbing. There really should be something to spell out ground support in between the interdiction. Did I miss something here? I've got airstrike. No, I don't think so. Yeah. And I think we do not get... Oh, no, we get ground support over here. So it's just in the wrong place. All right. In my opinion. But it does throw me for a loop, right? Air-to-air combat. Whenever air units are intercepted, ATAC takes place, involving 2 rounds of ATAC between F air units and potentially 2 rounds of ATAC between surplus remaining intercepting F air units and any opposing G air units. But remember, intercepting becomes blurry during a combat, from what we determined. But onward. In a round of ATAC between F air units, each F air unit on both sides undertakes an EC, and for each success, the enemy incurs 1 LP. After all EC are done, the LP are tallied and absorbed by each side. And that's going to send us over here to tell us what loss points against air units result in, which is one of 2 things, either aborting missions or damaging the units. And you expend LPs. Well, you expend you take effects to get rid of those LPs, essentially. Okay. After the second round of combat, deduct the number of remaining escorts from the number of remaining interceptors. Again, a blurry line when you're in the middle of a combat, from what I've interpreted this to say. And if the number is negative, then all F units of both sides finish their mission and check on-call status. If the number is positive, then that number of interceptor F units will attack any enemy G air units on the mission they were being escorted. In the case of interdiction and or ground support missions, where both sides send escorts, okay, now this is weird, because before it was, the way this was worded led me to believe you don't separate between escorts and interceptors, right? Then the side with the greatest number of escorts remaining can attack the enemy G units with the surplus of escorts. So instead of escorts here, you read that dual use functionality. This kind of, the ground combat air support line of communication interdiction, that whole thing has to be clarified, I think. That has to be nailed down a little better. That's fuzzy as hell. Okay. But I think we can work it out. I think we've done so. ATAC between F and G units is conducted in the same way, but with 2 exceptions. First, the G units suffer a +1 DRM for their EC. They're going to be less likely to hurt anything. Second, any LP inflicted by the G air units is deducted from the LP inflicted by the F air units. If the resulting amount is positive, then the number of LP needed to be absorbed by the G units, and if negative, then the number of LP need to be absorbed by the F units. Yeah, the wording is just a tangled mess. And the meaning there is whoever causes the most whoever gets the most successes does that many loss points to the enemy. But remember, the G units are fighting a defensive fight. They're not they're not going to be. They have that penalty on their die roll. Okay. Any remaining F units then immediately finish their mission and check on call. Any remaining G units may continue with their assigned missions. And they can't be intercepted again. So they might as well, they can take SAM hits. Absorbing LP in an ATAC. LP incurred in an ATAC are absorbed at the end of each round of combat and may be absorbed in a combination of ways at the owning player's discretion. 1 LP aborts the mission, throws it in the spent air box. You're not using that plane again that turn. 2 LP will damage the unit. You can either flip it and place it in the spent air box. Ouch. Sounds like 2 LP is you get damaged and the result of 1 LP. Or if already flipped, the unit is permanently eliminated and victory points are adjusted. Okay. Let's do ground support, and then I take my break. No, let's finish up the air stuff because we have SAMs too. When a combat is declared, whether me or Pa, both players may use G air units assigned to ground support missions to support units in combat, at the same time as any G units assigned to LOC interdiction. The phasing player decides first what air units, including interdiction, ground support, and escorts, to use. And then the non-phasing player makes the same determination. And I think you have to your ground support and interdictions are stuck in certain boxes, so you can only use planes from those boxes. After both players commit F air units, and then ATAC occurs. After the conclusion of this, then if any G units remain on the ground support mission, the player may add the highest ER. ER is the thing that you use on your EC. I think it's your effectiveness rating. I think. I gotta look back. And again, I'm more comfortable on the second read through. Yeah. I'm more comfortable on the second read through. The first time I'm just like, oh, what the fuck with all these acronyms? Okay. The highest ER of the, what am I talking about? After conclusion of this, if any G units remain in the ground support mission, the player may add the highest ER of the G air units as a CSA. Okay, that's like a bonus to your combat rating. I know that, but what does it stand for? Combat strength adjustments, which sounds like it's going to be a plus or minus to the combat strength, but I'm not sure that's the case. Oh, we get them here with me's and pa's and everything like that. The G air units then must check for SAM fire, and each remaining air unit that participated checks its on-call status. Okay, I'm still a little unhappy about how this is. It costs you 1 point to abort the mission, 2 points to damage or destroy the plane, and abort the mission for that plane. Yeah. And I assume if you take more than you can, I assume. So here it says either flip the unit and immediately place it in the spent air, or if already flipped, then the unit is permanently eliminated. I assume that one air unit can take 4 points and be just destroyed from full capacity. Not that air unit only expends 2 points and is flipped and put here, and then those 2 extra points might get disappeared. I assume that there's the possibility to wipe out an entire air unit but in one shot, but I'm not positive. Again, the way it's worded, it sounds like no, that's not the case, but okay. SAM fire. All G units, oh fuck, I gotta swap batteries. All right. All G units that just completed a mission and any air mobile units landing on enemy cities are subject to SAM fire. The opposing player rolls a D8 for each air unit or air mobile unit and applies the appropriate DRMs. If the result is a 7 or higher, the air unit is damaged or the air mobile is routed. It's flipped to its reduced side and placed in the spent air box, or if already reduced, permanently eliminated, VPs expended. Targeted units with, okay, there's problems here. Targeted units with a UQR of D do not roll for SAM fire unless in a friendly city that started the game in the player's control. Okay. UQR is your universal quality rating. If you're a shit unit, you have no surface-to-air missiles, but the city that you're in does. That's what it means. Targeted units is the units targeted by the air unit. SAM DRMs. Targeted unit has a UQR of A. That increases by 1. And again, targeted unit is the unit that's being targeted by the airplanes. Targeted unit is in a city hex, except a unit with a UQR of D, which does not get a DRM. Gets +1. But the targeted unit in a city hex with a UQR of D still gets a roll, just no DRM. And +1 for air mobile units landing on an enemy-controlled city. Then there's a bunch of example, or a little bit of example. Then we go to the last part of the air combat segment, which is on call. After each air unit completes any mission, after rolling for SAM fire, if relevant, then if the air unit is not spent, a check is done to see if it remains on call. If the air unit successfully passes an EC, it may stay on call. and either remain in the same mission box or switch to a different mission box at the player's discretion. If the EC is not successful, then the air unit goes in the spent box and won't be used until the next turn. Now, what that means is you pre-program the air missions that you're going to do, but once you fly them, if you remain on call, you can program a different air mission, or the same one again, for later in the turn. All right, breakies time, and how far are we? We're 10 out of 14 pages or so. Okay. Not fully charged, but... Okay, for the action phase, this is where you do your movement and combat, whatever. Heart of the game, starting with the player who holds the initiative, alternate back and forth, operating one unit at a time. When a unit's finished its activation, it goes static, it flips over to this kind of... Doesn't show you the type of unit, probably not too important in any ways, but... Once per turn, each player can attempt a de-escalation roll. If a player chooses to pass, and the de-escalation roll is an attempt to lock up and freeze an enemy unit, primarily if you're doing poorly, so it's kind of a catch-up mechanism. If a player chooses to pass, then they may not activate any more units that turn, and the other player can continue activating until they decide they're finished. If a hex is overstacked, one of those units must be activated and moved before any other units on that side may be activated. This could be really horrible, but there's nothing that prevents you from, like, passing with a stack of overstacked units. Well, any stack is overstacked. Unit that's activated chooses one of four activations: regular or strategic movement, a meeting engagement, or a prepared assault. I got a problem with this. A meeting engagement is not an activation, and you'll see that in a bit. It's part of regular movement. So I don't think they should be separated into things. I think it should be considered regular movement, possibly including a meeting engagement. Regular movement. When a unit is activated, it can move from hex to hex, paying the movement point cost of the terrain as specified in the TEC. For each hex entered, up to a total of its movement allowance. When completing the movement, the unit is flipped to its static side. The movement type is indicated by the color of its MA. And I'll tell you if I'm wrong, but that's what I remember. Black indicates motorized. Okay, so this is where we get these funny color for it. Black is motorized. Red is the mechanized or armor, but a black outline is foot, and those are the ones where some of them are well, almost all of them are invisible. Would have been nice to use a white print there instead, which they could have done perfectly fine. Instead, it's just an outline without changing the color. No, I think this was here. All right, which is just problematic to visibility. Okay. Strategic movement. This is the same as regular movement, except a unit doubles its movement allowance and may not move adjacent to an enemy unit. If it's using strategic movement, it's flipped to its static side when finished moving. Enemy units set aside for interdiction can attempt to interrupt a unit using strategic movement. Units using strategic movement may not move further than the furthest friendly unit in enemy territory, i.e. Russian Serbians may not move further west than the westernmost Russian Serbian unit, and a NATO unit may not move further east than the furthest. This is a little weird because it's not really doing what it should be. So, for example, the furthest east would be this Croatian unit, which would mean strategic movement could be used to ride as far east as that, and you could be entering occupied territory doing that, and that feels wrong. Similar to the Galicia game, I feel like there's some desire for something more than just a hex row or column delineation. In that game, They've got a hex by hex control delineation, which is a nightmare. What I'm looking for is something that's more of a compromise between the two, but I don't have an answer for it, which is, are you moving the front forward, right? Not are you moving units only as far as the furthest east unit, but are you moving within what is actually friendly territory? And friendly territory, so what you could define the frontage as is these guys are outside because I can trace a zone, I can trace between their zones of control, but basically I wouldn't be able to push past zones of control. Now, that's essentially covered already by the strategic movement not being able to move adjacent to a unit. So you might want to extend it a little bit better than that. Like if you say, well, this territory is clearly Serbian for some reason, like you can't even move adjacent to a zone of control or something along those lines. You might be able to simplify it and capture the effects a little bit better. But, you know, between the no zones of control and that easternmost or westernmost piece, maybe it'll handle it well enough. I'm not sure. We'll see if we run into any issues. Okay. So now, meeting engagement. A meeting engagement is a combination of regular movement and combat. A unit may undertake multiple ME during movement if it has the MP, movement points, available to do so. When adjacent to an enemy unit, the activated unit must spend MP equal to the movement cost of the enemy hex plus a chosen number of movement points, at least one, for the ME CSA. Now, the CSA is your combat strength adjustment. So the more movement points you spend, the more CSA you accumulate, starting with negative CSA. In an ME movement combat, only the lead unit may suffer losses, not any supporting units. And then they say, go to the combat procedure for more information. Final one's prepared assault. Now, they kind of cover it by saying ME is a combination of regular movement and combat. Look, you don't need, it's one thing, but okay, whatever. I can see wanting to segment them, but still. And Mr. Logic doesn't like it. Prepared assault, a PA. If one or more fresh units are adjacent to an enemy unit, they may conduct a PA against the enemy unit. The attacking player must designate one of those units as the lead unit. Only the lead unit will become automatically static after combat. A supporting adjacent unit does not become static unless it decides to advance after combat. Then any units who do so become static when finished. For the combat procedure, yeah. De-escalation roll. Okay, now this is the other thing you can do in your action phase other than passing. Each player may attempt one de-escalation roll once per turn during an action phase. De-escalation is a modified depending on the VP level and a successfully modified result of 7 or more. And is successful on a modified result. If successful, the phasing player may flip one fresh enemy unit of their choice to static, preventing the enemy unit from activating that unit in the current action phase. Use the following table for the DRM. If the victory point levels are low, very much in favor of the Serbs, there's a bonus for NATO, making the die roll. If the victory point levels are high, Russia or Serbia gets a bonus. Now, both sides can make the roll with no DRM, right? Use the following table to determine a DRM for de-escalation relative to the current victory point level. See, this says +1 for Russia or Serbia. There's no consequent -1 for NATO there. After resolving a successful de-escalation roll, the phasing player that just made the roll may then activate a unit or pass. If the de-escalation roll was unsuccessful, play immediately passes to the opponent. So what this is useful for is instead of taking before trying to take an action, you make the de-escalation roll. in the hopes of freezing an enemy unit. Now, you may end up with an inadvertent pass out of that if you fail, but if you succeed, not only do you freeze the enemy unit, you still get your activation. In fact, you must take it. Okay, and they talk about it. It's innumerable and unexpected events that could drastically change the ground situation. And I really like this. I like things that fiddle around with the enemy's ability to do stuff. What I'm a little bit less excited about is I get to choose when to take it and point to the unit and decide which one, but that makes it more of a player decision, and I can understand why that's appealing as well. Just the same way as being able to use cards in a CDG to interfere with the enemy's plans. You use it at the important point. You don't just use it, like an event that randomly happens. All right, combat itself. Combat's done the same way during ME or PA, but there's some differences to the adjustment and there's some differences to the end result. Whenever combat's declared, the players perform any relevant air operations, probably the LOC interdiction and ground support, along with escorts, and then each player randomly draws a combat chit. If there isn't one already there, needs to be specified, I think. Chooses, randomly picks the side, and puts it underneath the lead unit. For the defender, the lead unit is always the single defending unit. For the attacker, in an ME, the lead unit is the single activated attacking unit, while in a PA, the lead unit is selected. It is the attacking unit. I mean, when you do a PA, you pick one unit to be the lead unit. It's really kind of the same thing. It's just you have movement involved possibly with an ME. Each player then determines their own CSA for combat, all of which are summarized in 8.1 below and in the game charts. Well, maybe I'm missing something. I wouldn't put it past Blue Panther to have done that. Maybe instead of the game charts, I got an extra map. But the only place I have it is in the rule book. All CSA are cumulative. The appropriate CSA are added to the CS on the combat chit drawn, the combat strength associated with the UQRSLT or whatever it is. I can't remember what things are. What I mean is there is a quality level and there is a combat strength determined by that quality level, and you add the CSA to that. So that's fine. That's not what I thought it was. Or whatever. To determine the final CS, combat strength. Each player then rolls a d8 and adds the result to their final combat strength to get a final combat result, which will now be known as an FCR, just to give us another acronym that's used fairly heavily in this little section. The victor of the combat has the higher FCR, and the combat differential, also acronized to CD, is equal to the difference between the two FCR. Note that the defender does not go static from the combat unless it chooses to do so for loss absorption. The lead attacker will go static. Other participating attackers only go static if they choose to AAC, which is advance after combat, also given an acronym. This section is the worst part of the rules for the acronyms, and we're going to have to swap batteries. Of course, means I get a couple puffs in my pipe before it goes out on me again. All right. Applicable combat strength adjustments. I'm surprised it doesn't call it ACSA in this case. Okay. Air ground support plus the ER. Oh boy. ER? That's the effectiveness. Yeah, that's the effectiveness rating. I'm guessing of all the planes that are involved, but I don't know because this isn't spelled out very nicely. So we look here at 6.5 and we look to see what the effect is. And we get all kinds of stuff here. The highest ER of all the G units as a CSA, of all the ones that make it through. So it's going to be the ER of one plane. The UQR difference, which is +1 to +3, scaled difference in quality, which is listed here. Now this is interesting. The CSA is scaled for class. For example, an A unit fighting against a D would get a +3 CSA. Why? Because there's a 3 difference between A and D? I don't know. There's no chart that tells me this. Maybe there should be. I don't know. A B against a D would get +2. So all they're giving me is the for example. This would be much more helpful if these were numbers instead of letters so that I could modify that. But that would be confusing because I got numbers here and numbers there, right? So, you know, I kind of get it. But for somebody who's kind of slow at counting between letters, oh shit, my battery is not charging. For somebody who has trouble counting positions between letters very easily, this is not a good solution, but okay. Friendly units adjacent to combat hacks, +1 per unit excluding the lead unit. So this appears to be for both sides. So if you have nearby support as a defender, you get a bonus. If you have supporting units adjacent as an attacker, you get a bonus for each unit. Terrain, C9.0 or the TEC. Well, luckily the TEC is actually printed on the map, and it gives a combat note, some of which are cumulative, but we may have to look things up like rivers and ridges, is that it feels like it's probably only between the 2 lead units. Naval support, +2 for NATO if the defending hex is within 2 hexes of the Adriatic coast. Well, there's only 1 coast in this game, so that's fine. For MEs, the number of movement points spent, remember, there was a little chart. The more movement points you spend for your attack, the better your attack's going to be in terms of CSA. And then flanking attackers. Well, flanking attackers is a special rule. So we'll jump down here. Adjacent combat support and UQR we've already covered, so we can jump down to flanking units. An enemy unit is considered flanked. And again, this only goes for the attacker. An enemy unit is considered flanked if the friendly unit on the opposite side of the lead unit, if there is a friendly unit on the opposite side, or if there are at least 3 units, with or without the lead, in 3 non-adjacent hexes and next to the combat hex. So there's 2 ways to flank. One is you're on both sides of the enemy, and the other is you are every other hex on the enemy. At least. The flanking bonuses are cumulative with the bonuses for unit adjacency. Only fresh NATO and Russian units may provide flank support, but Serbian units can provide flank support whether fresh or static. So they're kind of bonus, actually. Now, if we look at the strengths here, flanking attackers are +2 each, max of +4, which means if I've got units on either side, one of them is the lead unit, the flanking unit, it only adds +2. But if I've got that 3-unit position, I've got 2 flanking units here, so I get the +4. And we've got the same thing on PAs. The flanking the flanking bonus increases on a prepared attack. Set piece battle, that's what I want to call it. But you have no movement point advantage there. So immediately it starts to look like the meeting engagement is actually more effective, but it's not. You'll see why, because in the losses, things change. We go to an example of combat, which really is just trying to express what's said there. Then the loss ratio. The losing side in combat suffers LP. This is the CD, combat differential, I guess, modified by the loss ratio, which is dependent upon the type of combat and who is the victor. A loss ratio can never be less than 1 to 1, nor more than 3 to 1. Loss ratio for ME. If the defender is the victor, you use a 1-to-1 loss ratio. That's as good as it gets. For every 1 point of the CD, combat differential, 1 loss point is inflicted on the attacker. I.e., if the attacker's FCR, final combat result, is 6, and the defender's FCR is 8, the CD is 2, and the attacker suffers 2 loss points. Okay. If the attacker is the victor, you use a 2-to-1 loss ratio where every 2 points of the CD, 1 LP is inflicted, always ignoring any remainder. Okay? ME is always going to be at a 2-to-1. You pay for every 2 difference, you cause 1 loss point. Is this rounded down? No, it's always ignoring the remainder. So you could win a battle without causing any loss points. Okay, for PA, loss points are generally at 1-to-1 ratio. Okay, but now we go to terrain. If the defender's in a city or mountain hex, then the loss ratio applied against the defender increases by 1. I.e., if it was a 2-to-1, it goes up to a 3-to-1. If it was a 1-to-1, it goes up to a 2-to-1. However, if the lead attacking unit is attacking along a highway, which is these yellow roads, then the loss ratio is decreased by 1. And that could cancel out the city bonus. Okay. Now, it says city, but there are also capitals. I'm assuming they count as cities because they're not addressed here as anything different. It would be nice if they showed both. They can't easily. There's not a lot of space here. But if you're doing a PE in the clear along a highway, it doesn't get better than 1-to-1. Satisfying loss points. All loss points have to be absorbed. Maybe they can't be, which may be done in several ways cumulatively. A defending unit can flip to static. That'll be a loss point. Retreats. You pick only one of the following 2 options. All units retreat 1 hex, and that's 1 LP. All UQR A or B unit may retreat 2 to 3 hexes to satisfy 2 LP. Okay, first of all units may retreat 1 hex. All units may retreat. No, they must. Yeah, I'll choose option B, where only my A and B units may retreat 2 to 3 hexes to satisfy 2 LP. That's badly stated, but it's also badly stated here, which is the all UQR A or B. No, the force, and this is the only way that it makes sense, the force has to be all UQR A and B units. If there are any C or D units, you can't pick this option. Other options, spend 1 VP to satisfy 1 LP, only if the lead unit can trace a line of communication at the time. I'm assuming you might be able to do that multiple times. It's not clear here. But so far, I'm at 1, 2, 3, 4 loss units, sort of as my maximum, including a VP. An adjacent supporting unit may go static to satisfy 1 LP each. Exception, supporting attacking units during an ME may not go static to support an LP. Finally, and I think this might often be the case, the lead unit can just be routed to expend all the LP. Because, for example, let's say I've got a C quality unit over here. Well, I could flip it to static for 1. It could retreat 1 hex for 1. It's not A or B, so it can't do this. I could spend 1 VP. That would be 3. I could easily have taken more than 3 LP, I think. Because these dice, are fairly different, right? And we're using the dice, I believe, aren't we? I'm trying to remember now. Each player determines their CSA from all the charts. All the CSA. Each player rolls a die and adds the result to the final combat strength. Yeah. Yeah. So you've got a possible difference of 7 coming from the dice itself, in addition to whatever else you have. If you're on a 1-to-1 ratio, you could very easily get over that 4. Now, can you spend multiple victory points? Maybe, but you might not want to. And then they give an example here, and maybe they talk about multiple victory points on it. I'm not a fan of reading these things. No, they just tell you how many LP you have to absorb, not the things that we need to know that are a little unclear. All right, retreating in advance after combat. A unit must attempt to retreat towards a supply source and away from an enemy unit if possible. Must attempt? If the defender's hex is vacated, the attacker may AAC, advance, into the hex with no movement point cost. Now, in an ME attack, they've already spent movement points to enter that hex. In a PA attack, they've spent their entire action to go into there. In an ME, the attacker may continue movement with any movement point that remain unspent. Note that the defender's hex is not vacated. The attacker may continue attacking in an ME if it has sufficient movement points to enter that hex again and to pay for the bonuses at once. In a PA, the combat hex is vacated by defending units. Roll a d8 and have the result. This is the AAC movement allowance. Oh, cool. We have an acronym for this. AACMA. For any attacking units involved that choose to advance, each unit may immediately move into the combat hex for no MP, and then it uses the AACMA. This is one that really didn't need to be included. To move in any direction. Any supporting units that choose to advance become static after they spend their AACMA, while any supporting units that do not advance at all remain fresh and in place. Terrain, the movement cost and combat cost for terrain are listed in the TEC, but the specifics are explained here. Clear as normal. Mountain costs 3 movement points for motorized and 2 for mechanized movement. Foot movement, the first mountain hex costs 2 movement points. Oh boy. But, and there's no indicator here that this is special, so you might not remember, it only costs 1 movement point for mountain to mountain movement from then on in that movement phase. In combat, the defender gets a +2 CSA bonus, and a loss ratio by which the defender absorbs losses is raised by 1 to a maximum of 3, which is also addressed here. Loss ratio 1-to-1 +1. Why does it say 1-to-1 there? I don't know. Yeah, I don't know why loss ratio goes from 1-to-1 / +1. If the defender wins, the loss ratio base is 1-to-1. If the attack, and it always is. If the attacker wins, they cause less losses because of the terrain. City hexes use the other terrain for movement and grant the defender +1 CSA in combat. And that star means cumulative, which I would have assumed since it has a plus in front of it. But mountain does not have a cumulative, but it's cumulative with these. A city also adds +1 to a SAM fire roll, except for UQRD units, which is sort of doesn't really belong, but terrain is its own rules set. Yeah, I thought we were still under combat. Capital city. Capital cities are treated the same as cities, except they're worth extra victory points when captured. They're denoted by a star. Okay, so that's clarified in the rules, if not on the thing. Crossing a river adds an additional 1 movement point for foot and mechanized and 2 for motorized. Okay. Defending behind a river grants the defender an additional +2 CSA. It says +1. Don't know which is there. I'll probably end up using the chart. Although the designer seems to like to make rivers pretty hefty. So maybe I'll write something on that. I don't know. In combat, in addition to the dominant terrain in that hex, it doesn't affect the loss ratio, though, which maybe it should. An attacker crossing a river, getting flung back, is a painful situation. But so is a defender getting pushed back across a river. Yeah. Crossing a ridge hex side adds an additional 1 MP for foot, 3 for motorized, and 2 for mechanized. Yeah. Non-foot unit, and I'm following this up because there have been discrepancies between tables and the rules in some of the other games that they've put out. So, where are we? Non-foot units may not support adjacent combat across ridge hex sides. Oh, we don't have a note of that. We do have here CS by foot only. That'll help. Okay. That's good enough. Trying to find this here. Nor may they participate in a PA unless as lead unit. Combat, which might mean the lead unit wants to lead the charge across. I don't know. Combat across a ridge hex side grants the defender a +1 CSA in combat, in addition to the dominant terrain in the hex. That is not spelled out here. It just says 1-to-1, 1-to-1, where it should say +1 there, I believe. Right? Okay. Highway. Moving along consecutive highway hexes costs a half movement point for foot or mechanized movement. Foot, mechanized, they have a 0.3 as they do for motorized. Oops. And a third for motorized. Okay, so there is our discrepancy we were expecting. Regardless of other terrain in the hex. Lead units which initiate attacks along highways reduce the defender's loss ratio by 1. Not specified, but never to less than 1-to-1. There should be at least a note on that. We've covered it before, but it's not just other terrain. Road, moving along consecutive road, costs 1/2 for all movement types. That's correct. Regardless of other terrain in the hex, roads do not provide the same loss ratio benefit as highways. And they've got it correct on the roads. They don't say anything. Cleanup phase. Okay. Cleanup phase. Here it is. Russian and NATO units that cannot trace an LOC during cleanup are immediately routed. Okay, I didn't remember that. Serbian units do not need to check for an LOC. All combat chits are removed from the map and placed back in the cup. Victory. Victory is going to be a representation of NATO morale. Oh, my battery's going down. VP go up for NATO and down for Russia, Serbia. An automatic major victory is achieved as follows. For NATO, if they go up to 20 or more, obviously we're not going to wrap around, or if a NATO unit enters Belgrade, spelled Beograd on the map. Russia and Serbia, the victory point total enters 0 or less, or if a Russian or Serbian unit makes it into Trieste, and that's at end of turn. The game begins with VP at 7. If an automatic victory is not achieved, you determine the winner by referencing the VP at the end of the game, and that's marked by the color. Okay. VP and divided by type. VP schedule. City hexes are worth 1 VP when you enter a city. Switching side moves it by 1, no matter whose city it is, whatever happens. Capital cities are worth 2 when a friendly unit occupies a capital city hex. Each NATO or NATO allied, each NATO allied Russian or Serbian unit is worth 1 victory point when it surrenders. Remember, surrendering generally comes from routed units that fail. Every time you exchange a victory point for LP, it's worth a victory point. Okay, and this is the thing. You can expend a victory point for a loss point, but if that unit gets routed and surrenders, it's worth only 1 victory point, which is why you probably will not want to expend more than 1 victory point to try to keep a unit on the map. Eliminated air unit, 1 victory point for each Russian or Serbian air unit, but 2 for each NATO unit. Setup was all Russian and Serbian units on the map, except for the Serbian reinforcements belonging to 3VO. Russian and Serbian units set up inside Serbia, Montenegro, and Bosnia, in or adjacent to city hexes. Up to 2 Serbian units can set up inside each of the 2 territories belonging to the Republic of Srpska. Yeah, God, I hate Slavic words. Those are these little red dashed things. And I seem to have gotten too many units in here. I think I gotta put one of these down there because he's in Srpska. Okay. Srpska is within Bosnia. My feeling was these were breakaway republics where the Serbs would be in, because we go further than this. NATO allies may set up anywhere in their home countries. NATO allied countries are Slovenia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and Croatia. Okay. We got Croatia, we got Slovenian. There are no Bosnian and Herzegovinian units, and Russia Serbians can set up inside Serbia, Montenegro, and Bosnia. But there's some specialized restriction for those breakaway republics or whatever that is worse. They're only allowed to put 2 units in each of them. All air units are available except for the NATO air reinforcements, which I assume are the ones by country. Those countries don't come in. That's what we got. I probably will not get started either tonight or tomorrow. I'm playing some XX with other live humans tomorrow. Other interesting news that I think the designer will find amusing, I got Facebook jailed. This time for making a pun about goats and kids, like young goats or kids. Unfortunately, that pun included shooting them. And the algorithm or 5 seconds of some, outsourced English, non-native English speaker trying to do any kind of moderation. And it's not 5 seconds. They're not allowed that long on average. Neither had time to read the whole thing nor to understand the context of the pun, nor certainly to read the continuing conversation in which the humor was applied. And this is like the 3rd or 4th time I've gotten dinged for something along these lines, where it's me and someone else just exchanging banter, where no one fucking is looking at it. It's just spam. Would have been fine in private, and it almost is in private. The only reason it's not like anybody digs into these comments. There's like 3 of us who play this little game, and unfortunately, my particular style of humor gets me in trouble all the time, which may be the end of Facebook for me at some point soon. I'm just sick of it. All right. Anyway, that's all she wrote for this intro part. I'll be getting back to it. Maybe I'll find out that I'm missing some charts and tables that I'm supposed to have. Maybe not. I don't know. But everything is pretty much present in the rules. The only question is, would it have been different? Would I find some kind of error in the charts and tables like I did on the TEC? Or, like, where the hell is NIS? All right. Up it goes.